The millionaire's autistic son hadn't spoken to anyone for years, until the nanny holds his hand and he decides to trust. But what the millionaire does when he sees the scene leaves everyone speechless. The fine, persistent rain turned Park Avenue into a blur of lights and impatience. Inside the armored town car, Richard Mercer felt time slipping through his fingers like sand, each minute stuck in traffic representing a small fortune lost in interest and business opportunities. He was a man who measured life in spreadsheets, a multi-millionaire whose wealth was built on the cold logic of numbers, of stocks that rose and fell on Wall Street with the predictability of a Swiss watch. His investment empire spanned continents with a net worth that placed him among the country's most powerful men. But here, gridlocked, he was just another prisoner of New York City's urban chaos. His phone vibrated on the dashboard, and the name Elena, the housekeeper, glowed on the screen. He answered with a sigh, expecting a domestic problem, another cog in the delicate mechanism of his life that had gone awry. Her voice, however, was cautious. "Mr. Mercer, the new girl is here. A little earlier than we expected." He frowned. The new nanny, hired in a rush, on the recommendation of a nurse from his son's physical therapy clinic, after the last caregiver had quit with eyes full of a pity he couldn't stand. They all arrived with promises of patience and technique, and they all left defeated by the silence of Leo, his son, a silence that, for Richard, was the materialization of his own guilt, an inheritance of absence and pain that all his money couldn't erase. When he finally reached the penthouse, an oasis of luxury, overlooking the green expanse of Central Park, he felt the usual tightness in his chest. He left his leather briefcase on the console table and crossed the living room, whose Italian marble floors reflected the cold light of the rainy afternoon. The silence that greeted him wasn't the usual one, the empty, heavy silence that echoed the absence of laughter and conversation. There was something else, a low sound, almost a melodic whisper coming from the sunroom. He walked slowly, his expensive shoes muffled by the Persian rug, and stopped at the doorway, unseen. And then he froze. The scene before him was a living painting that defied all the logic of his world. The new nanny, a woman with simple features and her hair tied in an unpretentious bun, was kneeling on the floor. She was softly singing an old Appalachian lullaby, a sweet and melancholic melody that smelled of damp earth and memories of a heartland he barely knew. And Leo, his boy, in his wheelchair, his body less rigid than usual, his small hand, which rarely tolerated touch, hovered in the air, and with a hesitation that broke Richard's heart, his fingers brushed against the woman's outstretched palm. The air, for the first time in years, didn't have the sterile scent of cleaning products, but rather the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Outside, the city roared, but in here, time seemed to have stopped. Richard, moved by an impulse he couldn't name, perhaps the need to control, to understand, to be a part of it, took a step forward. The minimal sound of his shoe on the marble was enough. Leo stiffened instantly, his arm withdrawn, his face turned to the window, the dome of silence closing around him once more. The magic was broken. The nanny, however, wasn't startled. She raised her eyes to Richard, and in them there was no fear, no submission. There was only a deep calm, a silent understanding. Before he could open his mouth to dictate the rules, to impose his presence as the owner of that capital and that home, she made a soft but firm request. "Stay," she said, her voice low, almost a secret. "But don't talk." The request hung in the air, charged with an authority that came not from status or wealth, but from something much older and more powerful. Richard opened his mouth and closed it. He, who commanded boardrooms and decided the fate of billion-dollar deals with a single word, felt disarmed. He looked at his son, huddled in the chair, and at the woman who watched him with serenity, For the first time in his life of orders and hierarchical obedience, he obeyed. The next day dawned with the same stubborn drizzle, but inside the penthouse, something had changed. Richard, who usually left before sunrise to dive into the cash flow of his businesses, found himself deliberately late. He stood in the hallway, hidden by the shadow of a marble pillar, watching the kitchen. Elena had whispered her name earlier, moved with an economy of gestures that bordered on reverence. She didn't speak to Leo, didn't try to force an interaction. She simply prepared his breakfast with a serene concentration. She cut the melon into tiny cubes, perfectly aligned on the plate. She served the juice in a specific cup, a plain blue plastic cup with no designs, which Richard had never noticed before. She placed it at the exact same spot on the wheelchair's tray, a precise distance from the boy's right hand. Richard felt a pang of irritation. It was a ritual with no apparent logic, an insignificant detail amidst a universe of expensive therapies and imported equipment he had acquired. He, who managed a multi-billion-dollar stock portfolio, couldn't decipher the value of that simple blue cup. He felt the urge to intervene, to ask, to optimize the process, but the memory of her request, "Stay but don't talk," held him like an anchor. Throughout the day, he cancelled 2 important meetings, claiming he was feeling unwell. The truth was, he was a hostage to a consuming curiosity. From the half-open door of his home office, he watched Anna introduce another of her silent routines. She took a box of felt scraps and began to glue small colored strips onto the polished floor of the hallway, creating a path that led from Leo's room to the sunroom. Each color, he later realized, seemed to carry a sensory instruction. The red, felt, rougher, was placed before the turns. The blue, soft, was for straight stretches where sunlight streamed through the window. Leo, who normally refused to leave his room, followed the path with the wheels of his chair, his small fingers touching each texture, his gaze focused on the floor as if deciphering a map to a treasure. To Anna, this apartment wasn't a display of wealth. It was a cold fortress that needed bridges. She had grown up sharing a room with 3 siblings, and poverty had taught her that the greatest assets weren't kept in safes, but built with patience and colored thread. She saw in Leo not a condition, but a language that no one had bothered to learn. In the late afternoon, another ritual. Anna took Leo to the immense glass-enclosed balcony. Together, in silence, they watched the New York sky change from gray to shades of orange and pink. The city's noise, which often triggered Leo's episodes, seemed different from that height. It was a constant hum, punctuated by the distant, melodic chime of an ice cream truck on the street far below. The boy, hypersensitive to sharp, unexpected noises, relaxed his shoulders, his body sinking into the chair. An almost imperceptible sigh escaped his lips. Richard, watching from the living room, felt a lump in his throat. Gratitude and fear waged a battle within him. This woman, with her colored felt and folk songs, was achieving what a fortune in medical investments could not, and that terrified him. Trust was not a currency he traded easily. Control was his armor, the only mechanism that protected him from the pain of loving and losing again. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of his head of security, a man whose loyalty had been bought with a staggering salary and generous bonuses. His voice, when he spoke, was low and sharp, stripped of all emotion. "I'm sending you a photo of a person. I want to know everything about her, where she came from, who her family is, every detail, and I want the report on my desk in 24 hours. The plain manila envelope, terse and heavy, was on Richard's mahogany desk before the first cup of coffee was even poured. The report was thorough, surgical, an X-ray of the life of Ana Morales. He read it with the same attention he devoted to analyzing a new investment, searching for gaps, for inconsistencies, for any hint of a hidden motive that would justify his suspicion. But there was nothing. Anna's life was an open book of simplicity and struggle. Born and raised on a small farm in rural Kentucky, the eldest of 5. Her father had passed away early, and at 17, she had taken on the responsibility of raising her younger siblings while her mother worked the fields. There were no suspicious debts, no ties to unsavory characters, no lawsuits. Her only asset was a small share of the family land, worth more sentimentally than financially. The report, which was meant to give him back control, only disarmed him further. The woman who sang to his son didn't have a secret plan to usurp his fortune. She had calluses on her hands and a history of resilience that his capital could neither buy nor measure. The discovery left him unsettled because genuine goodness was a variable for which his charts and projections had no answer. Frustrated, Richard changed tactics. If he couldn't control the source, he would at least try to decode the method. He spent the night in his office, not analyzing the Tokyo Stock Exchange, but buying books, titles on sensory integration in children with hypersensitivity, music therapy as a communication tool, developmental psychology. He read voraciously, underlining paragraphs, making notes, trying to turn Anna's intuition into a formula, a step-by-step guide that could be replicated and, if necessary, replaced. He wanted to dissect that silent magic, to understand it like an algorithm, so that he would never again be at the mercy of a gift that didn't belong to him. It was his way of fighting, of turning care into a controllable asset. Saturday arrived, and with it, Leo's physical and speech therapy session. For the first time in years, Richard didn't just drop his son off with the therapist and leave for his appointments. He stayed, hidden behind the one-way observation mirror he'd had installed at the clinic, a God's eye that gave him the illusion of omnipresence. He watched the speech therapist try, with professional patience, to coax any sound out of Leo. The boy remained mute, his gaze lost on the ceiling. Then, the therapist, remembering a comment from Anna, invited her to participate. Anna knelt beside the wheelchair and, without touching the boy, began to hum the same folk lullaby. The melody filled the sterile room. Leo slowly turned his face toward her. His lips moved, and then a sound, a long, clear, unmistakable ah on the same note as the song. Behind the glass, Richard held his breath. The sound, to anyone else, would be insignificant. To him, it was like watching one of his stock charts rocket toward the sky, an unexpected profit that made his heart pound erratically. On Monday, he didn't hesitate. The fear of losing that progress, of seeing Anna leave like the others, was greater than his pride. Gratitude mingled with his business instinct to retain talent. Beatrice, his personal assistant, a sharp woman whose loyalty was to Richard's empire and not the man, noticed the change. "Sir, the conference call with the Frankfurt investors. You seem distracted. Is there a problem with the European funds?" He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Cancel it, and get Mr. Roth from legal on the line. I have a new contract to draw up." On Tuesday, with the document in hand, he summoned Anna to his office. The room, with its dark furniture and panoramic city view, was the center of his power. He sat behind the desk, the polished wooden barrier between them. "Anna," he began, his voice formal, that of someone announcing the terms of a deal. "I am extremely satisfied with your work. Therefore, I've decided to adjust your salary." He pushed the paper across the desk. "It's a considerable raise, and there's a new clause, a retention bonus paid annually that guarantees your employment with us for a minimum of 5 years. He expected to see surprise, perhaps gratitude, but Anna just glanced at the paper, her face a mask of indecipherable calm. She didn't reach out to take it. Her silence was more deafening than any response, and in it, Richard felt the first crack in his armor of control. Anna's silence stretched, dense and heavy, filling the space between Richard's offer and her reality. He, accustomed to seeing powerful men yield to the figures he commanded, felt like a gambler who had played his best card only to see the table remain empty. Finally, She lifted her eyes from the paper, and in them was a dignity that disarmed him. "Mr. Mercer, I appreciate your generosity," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "It's a lot of money, more than I ever imagined earning, but I can't accept the extra amount." Richard blinked, confusion clouding his calculated expression, refusing a fortune. It was a move that didn't exist in his business playbook. "What I need," she continued, choosing her words as carefully as someone stepping on fragile ground, "isn't a bonus. It's the freedom to continue my routines without interference, without the need to explain every piece of felt on the floor or every song I sing. What works with Leo isn't a method you can buy. It's the trust we build in the silence." Her proposal was an absurdity in Richard's corporate world, where every step was measured, every asset was insured, and every employee was supervised. Blind trust was a liability, not an investment. Yet, the image of his son touching her hand, the sound of that first syllable, were dividends he could not ignore. With a slow, reluctant nod, he agreed. And that scared him more than any stock market crash. With this newfound freedom, Anna expanded Leo's universe beyond the glass walls of the penthouse. On a sunny morning, she announced simply, "Today, we're going to the green market." Richard nearly choked on his coffee. The Union Square green market, that chaos of smells, colors, and sounds. It was a sensory nightmare, a recipe for a severe meltdown, but he remembered his promise. He just watched, his heart tight, as she prepared a small bag with a blanket, noise-cancelling headphones, and a small spray bottle of lavender water. The city pulsed outside, a monster of concrete and opportunity, and Anna was about to throw his son into that arena. At the market, she moved with the calm of someone who knew the terrain. She ignored the loud stalls and led him to the fruit section. There, the spectacle was visual and tactile. "Look, Leo," she whispered, picking up a plum. "Smell this." She didn't force him to touch it. She just brought the fruit near his nose. Then she showed him a ripe peach. "This one is soft, and this one," she said, pointing to a pineapple, "is a little prickly. It's different." For the first time, Leo didn't shrink back. He stretched out his fingers and, with the tip of his index finger, touched the skin of the peach, a quick, hesitant, but voluntary touch. It was a monumental victory. However, Anna's victories began to generate an uncomfortable noise in Richard's inner circle. Beatrice, his assistant, who had been with him through the construction of his billion-dollar fortune, viewed this new closeness with pragmatic suspicion. To her, Anna was an uncontrolled variable, an emotional risk that could affect the business. "Richard, are you sure about this?" she questioned one afternoon, after hearing about the expedition to the market. "Exposing the boy like that, an employee with no formal training, any incident could become a legal problem, a stain on your image." Her concern wasn't for Leo, but for the armor of the Richard Mercer brand. The social pressure also tightened in the building's elevator. Mrs. Sinclair, the influential head of the co-op board and a neighbor, ran into Anna and Leo returning from their outing. Her eyes scanned the scene with cold judgment. "How brave of you to take the little boy to such a public place," she said, her saccharine tone hiding the venom. "I do hope this young woman has the proper training. The responsibility is immense." Anna just smiled, a shy smile that didn't reach her eyes, and pressed the button for their floor. But the seed of doubt had been planted, growing in the cracks of that luxury condominium, threatening to choke the fragile flower that was beginning to bloom in Leo's silence. Suspicion, once planted, is like a weed in a manicured garden. It grows in silence, twisting around the roots of the most beautiful things. Richard felt the words of Beatrice and Mrs. Sinclair echoing in his mind, turning Anna's small victories into calculated risks. Each of Leo's smiles was now a precious but volatile asset, whose market value could plummet with a single rumor. This subtle pressure, however, didn't seem to affect Anna. Confident in the bond she was building with the boy, she decided to take another step. The mall, on a Wednesday morning, would be the next destination. Less chaotic than the market, more structured, an environment of controlled stimuli. Richard agreed, but inside he felt as if he were approving a high-risk investment, betting a piece of his emotional capital on an operation with no guarantees. At first, everything went perfectly. With his headphones on, Leo watched the lights and storefronts with a serene curiosity, his fingers drumming softly on the arm of his chair. They stopped in front of a pet store, and the boy was mesmerized by the silent movements of fish in an aquarium. For a moment, Richard, watching them from afar, disguised among the customers of a coffee shop, allowed himself to breathe. Then chaos erupted. The mall's sound system, without warning, blasted a shrill promotional jingle, a high-pitched, repetitive tune. For most people, it was just background noise. For Leo, it was an assault, a sonic avalanche that shattered all his defenses. His body went rigid, his hands clamped over his ears, and a low, agonized moan escaped his throat. People around them turned to look, some with curiosity, others with open disapproval. It was then that Mrs. Sinclair, exiting a luxury boutique with shopping bags in hand, saw the scene. Anna didn't panic. With an agility born of practice and instinct, she pushed Leo's chair into a quiet alcove behind a deactivated escalator. She opened her bag and took out the lavender-scented blanket. She wrapped it around the boy's shoulders, creating a tent, a sensory refuge. "I'm here, Leo, I'm here," she whispered, her voice firm and calm as she began to hum the lullaby. The boy's moans subsided, turning into choked sobs. The crisis was contained, but the social damage was done. Mrs. Sinclair watched the scene with her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, seeing not an act of care, but a public spectacle of incompetence. Richard arrived in minutes, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found them in the improvised safe corner. Leo, calmer, had his head resting on Anna's lap as she read to him in a low voice. The gratitude he felt was as overwhelming as the fear of what this episode could mean for his reputation. That night, the duality of his feelings consumed him. He looked at Anna, who was preparing Leo's dinner, and saw his son's savior, but he also saw the woman who, unintentionally, exposed his greatest vulnerability to the world. Seized by an impulse to protect that connection at all costs, to imprison that miracle within his walls, he made a drastic decision. He waited for her to finish and approached her in the hallway. His voice was grave. "Anna, come with me." He led her to the door of his study, the sanctuary that had remained untouched since his wife had left. He took an old, heavy brass key from his pocket. "This is my space. No one comes in here. But you can. Choose books, records, whatever you need for Leo." It was an unprecedented offer of trust, a piece of his soul handed over in metal. Her eyes lit up with emotion. But as she reached for the key, he took a step back and pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Of course, we'll need to formalize this. A new non-disclosure agreement, a more detailed one, just to ensure everyone's security." The key, which a second before had been an invitation, now felt like the lock on a golden cage. The brass key, which seconds before had seemed like a treasure, now dangled from Richard's hand like a dead weight. The glow of trust had been snuffed out by the shadow of letterhead. Anna looked from the key to the document and then to his face, and her expression, once illuminated by genuine gratitude, settled into an impenetrable serenity. She didn't retreat, but she didn't step forward either. She simply kept her hands clasped in front of her, a simple gesture that erected an invisible barrier. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice maintaining the same low, respectful tone. "I can't sign a document like this without reading it carefully and without understanding why it's necessary now." To Richard, this was an affront. In his world, contracts were the foundation of everything. They were the universal language that protected his assets, defined the boundaries of his business, and turned uncertainty into manageable risk. No one questioned his contracts. They were the manifestation of his power, the guarantee that his vast fortune was secure. He felt the heat of irritation rise in his neck. It's standard procedure, Anna. Just a formality to protect my son's privacy and my family's. He tried to keep his voice neutral, the voice of a CEO explaining a clause to an employee, but beneath the surface, frustration simmered. "I understand the need for privacy," she replied, unshaken. "I protect Leo with my life, but our connection, what makes him feel safe, isn't written on any paper. It's in the silence." In trust, she took a hesitant step closer to the desk, but not to take the contract. She pointed to the key. "You're offering me the key to the most personal place in your home, a place that holds your memories. That is a huge gesture of trust." Then, her gaze fixed on the document. "But this paper says the opposite. It says your trust has limits, that it needs witnesses and a lawyer. You want to trust me, but in handcuffs." The metaphor hit him like a punch. Handcuffs. That was exactly it. He wanted her gift, the magic she worked with his son, but he wanted to cage it, catalog it, turn it into his own proprietary asset, protected by termination clauses and penalties for breach of confidentiality. He wanted the bond, but without the vulnerability it demanded. The realization left him naked, exposed in his own seat of power. He, the multimillionaire who controlled a massive amount of capital, was trying to buy the soul of a relationship that could only be earned through surrender. The silence in the office was sharp, broken only by the distant hum of the air conditioning and the crackle of a gas fireplace. He kept lit more for aesthetics than for warmth. He looked at Anna's face. She wasn't challenging him. She was seeing him. She saw the fear behind his armor of wealth, the pain that made him turn everything into a transaction. She saw the terrified father, not the ruthless billionaire, and in that moment of brutal clarity, Richard understood. To have what money couldn't buy, he had to give up his most powerful tool, control. With a sudden movement that made her take a small step back, he snatched the contract from the desk. He didn't tear it. He walked to the fireplace, the flames dancing behind the glass. He opened a small hatch and, without a word, tossed the document into the fire. The paper curled, blackened at the edges, and was consumed by an orange and blue blaze, turning into ashes that floated for an instant before disappearing. The gesture tore a hole in the wall he had built around himself, a hole that, for the first time, felt more like a bridge than a breach. He turned back to her, his face lit by the fire, his expression unreadable, and held out his hand again, this time offering only the key. That gesture, the burning of the contract, melted a part of the ice that had encased Richard's heart. In the days that followed, a new, fragile choreography was established in the penthouse. He began to come home earlier, not to watch from a distance, but to sit in an armchair in the corner of the sunroom, while Anna and Leo performed their sunset ritual. He didn't speak. He was just present. And his silent presence began to be woven into their routine. Anna, for her part, used the key to the study, not to snoop, but to choose old vinyl records that were gathering dust. She discovered that Leo, who was startled by digital sounds, was soothed by the gentle hiss of the needle running through the grooves of a classical music record. The bridge built over the breach of distrust seemed to be solidifying, brick by brick. But peace, in an empire like Richard's, is always under surveillance. Beatrice, his assistant, watched the transformation with the coldness of someone analyzing an unstable assets chart. To her, the nanny's growing influence was a dangerous liability, a distraction that pulled her boss away from the crucial decisions that kept the gears of his fortune turning, generating profits and dividends. One afternoon, she walked into Richard's office with a tablet in hand. and the urgency of someone announcing an unmissable business opportunity. "Richard, I know your focus has been on Leo, and that's commendable," she began, her voice calculated. "But precisely because of that, I found something that could amplify the results. A clinic in Switzerland, revolutionary, data-driven methods, with an 82% success rate in cases of severe hypersensitivity. Think of it as the best investment you can make in the most important asset of your life." She slid her finger across the screen, showing charts, progress projections, video testimonials from smiling European families. To Richard, this was his native language. These were metrics, return on investment, a business plan for his son's recovery. Anna's approach was full of soul, but it was unpredictable. The Swiss clinic offered the promise of control, of results guaranteed by a high investment in euros. The seed of doubt, which he thought he had burned in the fireplace, sprouted again, stronger and more seductive than ever. He tried to convince himself it wasn't a betrayal. It would be a merger, the union of Anna's care with cutting-edge technology. That evening he asked her to talk on the balcony as the sky began to tinge with pink. "Anna," he said, his voice strangely formal, "we've made incredible progress. Thanks to you, but I want to offer Leo every possible tool. There's a clinic, one of the best in the world, that could accelerate the process." He didn't realize how cold the word process sounded, as if his son's development were a cash flow to be optimized. Anna listened in silence, her face becoming an expressionless mask. The pain that hit her wasn't anger, but a deep, cutting disappointment. He still didn't understand. After everything, he still believed the solution could be bought, imported, contracted. The trust she thought she had built was, in the end, just a short-term investment, to be replaced by a safer, more promising fund. "I understand, sir," was all she said. The formality in her voice was like a door closing. The next morning, while Richard was on a call with the clinic discussing travel logistics, Elena found him at the office door, her eyes red. "Sir, Anna, she's leaving." Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. He ran to the hallway and found her near the door, her small, worn backpack on her shoulder. He opened his mouth to speak, to order, to offer more money. But before any word could escape, Leo's fragile, almost forgotten voice cut through the air. From his wheelchair, looking directly at Anna's back, he articulated, with a monumental effort, the only word that mattered: stay. The word stay hung in the air, fragile and immense. It wasn't a sound, it was a seismic event, a tremor that reordered the structure of power and silence in that apartment. Richard froze, his entire body paralyzed. His mind, trained to process stock market fluctuations and close multi-million-dollar deals in seconds, simply stopped. That single-syllable sound from his son was the most valuable dividend he had ever received in his life, and he had done absolutely nothing to earn it. All his capital, his assets, his accumulated wealth suddenly seemed like a pile of useless paper in the face of this achievement born from someone else's patience. Anna turned slowly. The pain of betrayal was still in her eyes, but now it was mixed with an overwhelming emotion. Leo's request wasn't just for her to stay, it was an acknowledgement, a forged bond she could not break. She looked from Leo to Richard, and her gaze was no longer that of an employee, but that of a guardian. Richard, dismantled, took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Don't go," he whispered, his voice hoarse, stripped of all its authority. I was wrong. The clinic, the charts, it's the only way I know how to try and fix things. By buying solutions." He took a deep breath, his pride crumbling like ash. "Give me a chance. Give us a chance." It was then that Richard's business mind, even in tatters, clung to one last logical structure. He picked up his phone and, with trembling fingers, called the clinic in Switzerland. Anna watched him, suspicious. He didn't ask to cancel. He asked for a deadline. 4 weeks, he said into the phone, his voice regaining a shred of firmness. I want to evaluate the progress of a homegrown method with clear metrics, noise tolerance in decibels, eye contact duration in seconds, number of articulated syllables. I'll send a weekly report. If there's no progress, I'll confirm the spot." He hung up and looked at Anna. 4 weeks to prove that your way is the right way. Anna felt the weight of that challenge. He still needed his numbers, his spreadsheets, but now he was willing to fill them with her raw material. She nodded slowly, but not with submission. There were conditions. "I'll stay," she said, and for the first time, her voice carried a weight of equality, but with 3 rules. First, total transparency. No more secret plans or background checks. Everything concerning Leo, we decide together. Richard swallowed hard and nodded. Second, I want supervision from a professional, an occupational therapist from the city's public network that I know. Her name is Lucia. She'll come here once a week to validate what we're doing. I don't want anyone saying I'm an amateur putting your son at risk. That bruised Richard's ego. Bringing someone from the public system, he paid for the country's top specialists. But he saw the wisdom in it. It was her protection. He agreed again. "And the third?" he asked, dreading the answer. Anna looked directly into his eyes. "The third is you, not as a boss, not as an observer. You will participate in everything. You will learn the colors of the felt. You will sit on the floor. You will sing the song. The sweat has to be yours too." The demand left him breathless, but Anna's determined gaze and the sound of the word "stay" echoing in his soul left him no choice. "I accept." That night, after Leo was asleep, Anna went to the living room with a guitar she had found in the back of a closet. She placed it in Richard's hands, whose fingers were accustomed to signing contracts, not pressing strings. "The song has 3 chords," she said. "Let's start with the first." The guitar felt like an alien object in Richard's hands. His fingers, which danced across computer keyboards and signed documents that moved fortunes, were now clumsy and slow on the nylon strings. The first chord he attempted sounded like a strangled cat, a discordant, metallic noise that made him wince. Frustration was immediate and visceral. He was a man accustomed to mastery, to competence. Failure, even in such a trivial task, was a bitter taste he hadn't experienced in years. "I can't do this," he said, his voice low and hard, about to set the instrument aside. Anna, sitting across from him on the rug, didn't move. She just waited. "It's not about the right note, Mr. Mercer," she said softly after a long silence. "At least, not now. It's about the consistency. Leo doesn't need a musician. He needs to feel that you're trying, that the sound, even if it's ugly, is for him." The effort began to involve sweat, as she had predicted. Nights that were once dedicated to analyzing the crypto market and the performance of his investment funds were now spent with trembling fingers, trying to find the right position on the fretboard. Repeating the same chord until the tips of his fingers grew numb, the daytime routine became a training ground for his humility. He sat on the floor, his straight back protesting the unusual posture, and helped lay out the colored path with the felt strips. He learned the order, the rough red before the turn in the hallway, the smooth yellow at the passage to the kitchen, the soft blue under the living room window. He realized it wasn't random. It was a sensory map that guided and soothed Leo's mind. His spreadsheets, once filled with profit projections and liability analyses, now gained new columns. Lavender scent, sound of rain, texture of blue felt. They were metrics that would make his partners laugh. But to him, they held the value of a newfound treasure, and the dividends, though small, began to appear. One afternoon, as he strummed the out-of-tune melody on the guitar, Leo, who was a few feet away, turned his head and watched him for 3 whole seconds before looking away. Richard noted on his mental spreadsheet a 200% increase in eye contact duration. He felt a euphoria that no stock market surge had ever given him. But while Richard immersed himself in this new emotional ecosystem, the machinery of his empire continued to turn, and Beatrice, the guardian of that machinery, viewed the situation with growing alarm. For her, the equation was simple. The time Richard dedicated to the colored floor was time stolen from conference calls that could yield millions in profit. Her loyalty was not to the father, but to the billionaire whose sharp mind guaranteed the assets and stability of thousands of employees. She saw Anna not as a caregiver, but as an uncalculated risk, a volatile asset that was destabilizing the system. And she decided to act, not out of malice, but with the precision of a crisis manager protecting her business. In a discreet call, made from her own cell phone, she contacted a photographer who specialized in candid shots, a professional whose silence was as expensive as his images. "I don't want a scandal," she said, her voice as cold as ice. "I want an image, one that reminds him of his vulnerability, of how the world out there sees him, one that will make him return to the tower where he is safe." The next day, as Richard, Anna, and Leo prepared for their first outing to the park as part of the new routine, a man with a long-lens camera positioned himself discreetly behind a thicket of azaleas. He didn't know the names of his prey, only the value of the investment made to capture that moment. The walk in the park at dawn was a glimpse of a world Richard thought he had lost forever. The morning air was crisp, smelling of wet grass and damp earth. Leo, for the first time in years, was outside the confines of the penthouse, not for a doctor's appointment, but for pure and simple leisure. He wasn't smiling, but his shoulders were relaxed, and his eyes followed the clumsy flight of a duck landing on the pond. Richard, beside the wheelchair, didn't dare speak. He just felt the timid warmth of the sun on his face and the presence of his son and Anna, a small nucleus of peace in the midst of the awakening city. In that moment, he was not the multimillionaire whose decisions affected the profitability of investment funds on 3 continents. He was just a father, witnessing a silent miracle. He felt a wave of gratitude so pure it made him dizzy, a form of wealth that couldn't be converted into dollars or gold. The long lens, hidden 50 yards away, captured exactly that. The powerful man, disarmed, looking at his son with a vulnerability that was worth a fortune to the vultures of gossip. The next day, the digital poison spread. The photo was leaked, not to a major newspaper, but to something far more dangerous, an anonymous social media account specializing in candid shots of billionaires. The image itself was innocent, but the caption was cruel and calculated. Absentee or eccentric dad, Richard Mercer, the Midas of Wall Street, exposes special needs son in public outing with mysterious caregiver, PR stunt or negligence. The photo went viral. Within hours, it was the talk of circles, where discretion was the most valuable asset. For Beatrice, it was proof she had been right. For Mrs. Sinclair, it was the ammunition she needed. She called an emergency co-op board meeting, the agenda veiled in euphemisms, discussion regarding security protocols and the building's image. In practice, it was a trial. In front of other wealthy residents, she brandished a printed copy of the story. "This affects all of us," she said, her voice laden with false concern. "The safety of our children, the reputation of our property. We cannot allow unstable situations to compromise the environment we have built." Richard felt the impact in waves. First, fury at the invasion of privacy. Then, panic at seeing his son turned into a spectacle. And finally, a corrosive, overwhelming guilt. He had failed to protect him, and in his mind, clouded by fear and humiliation, he searched for a culprit, a point of origin for the disaster. His gaze fell on Anna. Before her, his life was an impenetrable fortress. With her, the walls had become bridges, and through those bridges, the enemy had entered. That night, the tension in the penthouse was palpable. Leo, sensing the adult's distress, regressed. He refused to leave his room, curled up in his chair. It was the last straw for Richard. He waited for Anna to leave the boys' room and intercepted her in the hallway. His voice was low, but sharp as broken glass. "This is your fault," he said, his face a mask of pain and anger. "You and your ideas about going out, going to parks, exposing us. You exposed him." Anna looked at him, her eyes full of a deep sadness. She didn't cry. She just answered with a truth that hit him with the force of a punch. "The exposure didn't come from the park, Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice firm. "It came from inside your house." A cutting silence fell between them. He couldn't accept that truth. It was easier to blame the stranger than his own world. "I need some time," he said, his voice frigid, retreating behind his defenses. "As a precaution, you'll be on leave for a week. Your salary will be paid. Elena will take care of Leo." Everything seemed lost. The silence that settled over the penthouse after Anna's departure was different. It wasn't the heavy silence of Leo's absence, but an active void, a liability on his emotional balance sheet that seemed to suck all the air and color from the luxurious rooms. Elena moved through the house like a ghost, her shoulders slumped under the weight of a guilt she didn't know how to express. Richard, for the first time in years, was truly alone with his son, and the responsibility was crushing him. Determined to prove he could control the situation, that the method was just a replicable technique, he took out the box of felt. "Come on, champ," he said, with a false cheerfulness that didn't even convince himself. He knelt on the marble floor and began to recreate the colored path, but his logical mind arranged the colors by hue, from lightest to darkest, ignoring the sensory order Anna had established. When he placed Leo in the wheelchair at the start of the path, the reaction was immediate and devastating. The boy stiffened, his hands gripping the arms of the chair, an invisible barrier rising around him. Richard tried and insisted, his frustration growing with each of his son's refusals. It was then that a flash of memory hit him. The image of Anna explaining to the therapist that the rough red felt always came before a turn, to warn him of the change in direction. It was a detail, an insignificant detail that suddenly seemed like the key to everything. With his heart pounding, he remade the path, this time in the correct order, Anna's order. When he placed Leo back at the beginning, the boy hesitated for a second, and then slowly began to move the wheels, his fingers touching each texture as if reading a familiar score. And then Richard understood. It wasn't a method, it was a language, and each color, each texture, was a word of affection and security. The true assets of that relationship weren't the techniques, but the details born of observation and care. That night, he picked up the guitar. His fingers, still sore, found the chords with difficulty. The sound he produced was crooked, out of tune, but he persisted, playing the lullaby in an almost unrecognizable way. He didn't notice that Leo had approached in silence. Suddenly, he felt a light weight on his shoulder. His son's small head had come to rest there, a gesture of pure trust, of total surrender. Richard stopped playing, smelling the baby shampoo in Leo's hair, and cried, silently, so as not to break the spell, the hot tears of a billionaire who had just discovered the true nature of his assets. The next morning, he knew what he had to do. He sought out Elena. "I need to find her. I don't have her address. Her phone just goes to voicemail." The housekeeper, whose eyes were swollen with guilt for having doubted Anna, confessed, "She told me, sir, in case of an emergency." Her voice was a whisper. On rainy Saturdays, she sells cornbread muffins at the Port Authority bus terminal to help her family back in Kentucky. She said business is better when the weather is bad. The revelation hit him with the force of a punch. He had sent her away, and she, without complaint, had returned to her world of silent struggle. Saturday arrived with the same fine rain as the day it all began. Richard drove to Port Authority, his luxury car completely out of place amidst the rushing crowds and the arriving and departing buses. And there she was, under the cover of a makeshift stand, her face serene, offering a muffin to a traveler. He approached, his expensive suit damp from the drizzle. She saw him, and her face showed no surprise, only a weary expectation. He didn't apologize with empty words. He offered actions. "I fired Beatrice," he said, his voice firm over the noise of the terminal. "The photo came from inside my circle. It was my fault." He took a deep breath. "And I confronted the co-op board. I brought in a public school specialist that Lucia recommended. I spoke about the Americans with Disabilities Act and about sensory respect. The building is going to implement new rules." She watched him, the fine rain dampening her shoulders. And for the first time, she didn't know what to say. The Port Authority bus terminal, with its constant flow of arrivals and departures, became the unlikely stage for rebuilding a broken trust. Richard's words, simple and direct, carried the weight of concrete actions. Firing Beatrice wasn't just dismissing an employee, it was the amputation of a right hand, a pillar of his empire built on the premise of invulnerability at all costs. Confronting the co-op board hadn't been a mere formality, but a declaration of war against the veiled hypocrisy of his peers, a conscious choice to protect his son over his status. Anna listened, the smell of cornbread and rain mingling in the air. She didn't see the multimillionaire begging for forgiveness, but the father who had learned to fight the right battle. The muffin she held in her hand trembled slightly. She held it out to him. "It's still warm," was all she could manage to say. Richard took the piece of cornbread, its soft texture a contrast to the hardness of everything he knew. He ate it right there, standing in the rain, and that gesture of silent communion sealed a new contract between them. One that needed no paper or signatures. Anna's return to the penthouse was quiet, without fanfare. Leo greeted her with a long, deep look, an acknowledgement worth more than any words. The following weeks became a period of intense immersion. Richard reorganized his business schedule, delegating decisions, foregoing meetings he once would have considered vital to maintaining his fortune. His presence became a constant in Leo's routine. Not as a supervisor, but as a dedicated student. He learned to differentiate the textures of fruit at the green market, to recognize the exact melody that soothed the boy during summer thunderstorms, and his fingers, once clumsy, could now draw a passable version of the lullaby from the guitar. Christmas lights began to appear on the balconies of neighboring buildings, painting the New York night with colors of hope, and the smell of rain before New Year's Eve seemed to wash away not just the asphalt, but old wounds as well. Leo's progress, measured on Richard's new spreadsheets, was undeniable. His noise tolerance had increased, eye contact had lengthened, and small syllables were being tested, like birds rehearsing their first flight. The climax of this joint effort came on a Saturday afternoon when Anna, with Richard's help, organized a small folk music circle in the building's garden. They invited an old guitarist she knew from Greenwich Village. The neighbors, now embarrassed and curious, watched from their windows. In the middle of a melody, as the guitarist played Leo's favorite song, the boy, who until then had only babbled sounds, looked at the blue blanket on his lap, touched it, and said, with a clarity that made everyone's heart stop, "Blue, stay." 2 words, a subject and a verb, a complete sentence. The guitarist stopped playing. The world seemed to hold its breath. Richard felt an overwhelming urge to run, to hug his son, to lift his small wheelchair and shout his victory to the entire city, but he held back. He looked at Anna, who had silent tears streaming down her face. She held her hand out toward Leo, an invitation. The boy touched her hand. Only then did Richard approach, kneeling slowly beside the chair and offering his own hand. It was the price of patience, controlling his own impulse so as not to break the invisible thread of trust they had woven together. That moment of restraint, of respect for his son's time and space, was his greatest proof of transformation. And in the middle of that silent celebration, Richard's phone vibrated in his pocket. It was an international number. The Swiss clinic, punctual as a clock, was calling back with the news he had both dreaded and desired. There was an opening, an unmissable one, for the following month. The offer from the Swiss clinic hung over the garden like a storm cloud, threatening to drown the fragile joy of the moment. The word unmissable echoed in Richard's mind, a siren song appealing to his old nature, that of the man who believed the best solutions had a price, usually in euros, and came with an international seal of approval. The father, transformed by patience and blue felt, was fighting a silent battle against the billionaire seduced by data and charts. That night, on the balcony where the city seemed to breathe with them, he presented his proposal to Anna. It was a compromise, a business plan for the heart. "We could go," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Just for a month. A trial. And you could support us remotely, by video. It would be the best of both worlds." He believed in the logic of those words, but Anna felt the stab. He still saw her world as support, a sentimental accessory to the efficient machine of science. He still didn't trust her. Instead of pleading or arguing, she chose to disarm him with the only truth she had left, her own vulnerability. "Mr. Mercer," she began, her voice low but firm, "there's something you don't know. I don't have a college degree. I didn't study at expensive universities. I'm ashamed of that. Here, surrounded by so much luxury, so many important people." She took a deep breath, gathering the courage that had guided her whole life. "What I know, I learned at home. My younger brother, Tiago, he's on the autism spectrum. I learned by watching, by making mistakes, by singing to him when he hid from the world. I learned that his silence had a rhythm, that his hands looked for textures, not touch. Everything I did for Leo, it was a song I already knew." The confession, stripped of all pride, demolished Richard's last wall. Touched by her brutal honesty, he confessed the guilt that haunted him, the true engine of his need for control. "I tried to buy solutions, Anna, for everything. I wasn't there during the pregnancy. I was closing a deal in Asia, and when Helena left, the guilt consumed me. I thought if I controlled every detail of Leo's life, if I bought the best equipment, the best doctors, I could make up for my absence. I tried to buy control so I wouldn't have to feel." In that instant, the masks fell away. He wasn't the boss. She wasn't the employee. They were just two people, wounded and imperfect, trying to find a way. And it was in that space of silence and truth that the decisive action came from the one least expected. Leo, who had been watching the scene from the sunroom door, did something he had never done before. With visible effort, he pushed the wheels of his own chair forward, moving deliberately toward them. He stopped between them, reached out his small hands, and with a determination that seemed to spring from the depths of his soul, he took Richard's hand with his right and Anna's with his left. He looked at one, then the other, and vocalized a single word that redefined the entire universe. Together. That was the end of the battle. Richard picked up his phone. With a quick gesture, he declined the spot at the clinic, but the real sacrifice came next. He called his top partner and, in the clear voice of someone who has just discovered the true value of his assets, backed out of a billion-dollar merger that had been in the works for months. "I need a flexible schedule," he explained, without giving further details. "My priority is to follow a homegrown plan, validated by local professionals." The romantic justice, the only kind that mattered, arrived in the final minutes of that night. He handed Anna a new contract. In it, she was promoted to head caregiver, with a salary that reflected her new position, and a clause that funded her complete technical certification in occupational therapy. Only then, after she had signed, with tears in her eyes, did he lean in and kiss her. A brief, emotional kiss that tasted of rain and coffee, on the balcony where the city, for the first time, seemed to breathe with them. The miracle wasn't a cure, it was the daily choice to stay, even when it hurts. The morning of the last day of the year dawned clear and golden, washed clean by the previous night's rain. On the balcony overlooking Central Park, the air no longer smelled of loneliness and bitter coffee, but of damp earth and the promise of a new beginning. Richard held the guitar, and the melody of the lullaby, now soft and in tune, flowed from his fingers as naturally as breathing. Leo, at his side, gently swayed his head to the rhythm of the music, his eyes fixed on the tree leaves dancing in the breeze. Anna, standing behind them both, rested her hands on Richard's shoulders, a gesture of silent partnership that had become the new architecture of their family. The chaos of the city still roared in the distance. But there, in that haven of glass and hope, the only sound that mattered was the music they had learned to play together. Richard's transformation was not an abdication of his empire, but a redefinition of its terms. He was still a formidable businessman, a billionaire whose decisions still influenced Wall Street, but his concept of wealth had changed. He had learned that time was the most precious asset, and his most important cash flow was the count of hours he spent with his son. His net worth was no longer measured solely in dollars, euros, or Bitcoin, but in Leo's rare smiles and Anna's growing trust. He delegated the management of several investment funds and turned down deals that required long trips, explaining to his stunned partners that he was diversifying his portfolio to include long-term assets with extremely high emotional returns. Anna, in turn, had embraced the opportunity to study with a fierce dedication. At night, the large marble dining table, once a cold and lifeless space, was now covered with her occupational therapy textbooks. She and Richard would spend hours discussing theories, merging her intuitive wisdom with his analytical mind, creating a unique approach for Leo's development, which was now closely monitored by Lucia and other professionals who respected the foundation of affection they had built. Their journey was not a straight, upward line. There were days of regression, moments of frustration, but the difference was that now they faced the downturns together as partners in a sacred enterprise. One afternoon, while walking in the park, Leo pointed to the pond and, for the first time, formed a short sentence to express a desire. "Leo wants water." The simplicity of those words was, for Richard, more valuable than any inheritance, more profitable than any stock he had ever bought. He looked at Anna, and in her gaze, he saw the reflection of his own joy. The miracle wasn't the cure, but the communication. It was the bridge they had built, syllable by syllable, color by color, note by note. That night, as they watched the first New Year's Eve fireworks paint the sky, Richard made no resolutions. He just held Anna's hand tighter and felt Leo's head rest against his chest, falling asleep to the distant sound of the celebration. He finally understood that true fortune wasn't in accumulating assets to shield oneself from pain,